I Will Make You Proud by Where Does She Go? Read to you by Hummingbird Audio. Trigger warning. This fic includes talk of suicide, talk of abuse, and potential sexual content. Please read with care. Okay, I know I already gave a disclaimer, but this chapter gets super duper spicy. I'm going to put the timestamps in the description. If you're not comfortable with sexual content and you want to skip over that, again, read with care. It's intense. As someone who's been abstinent for 3 years, it hit me a certain way. So, enjoy. Chapter 22, The Manor. Hermione, June 2006. The first thing Hermione became aware of when she next awoke was the noise. It wasn't silent, as it had been in the cell. She could hear... Was that birds? She listened intently. She could hear birds. She lay for a moment and waited for the pain in her head to come, to slice through her vision and leave her screaming. But it never came. She lay there a moment more, listening. She could still hear the birds chirping and twittering happily. It wasn't her imagination. It was real. She frowned and allowed her eyes to flutter open. She wasn't in her cell. She looked around, her eyes wide. She was in a darkened room. The heavy velvet curtains at the window had been drawn, but she could see a sliver of daylight in the crack between them. She was lying in a bed. She looked up at the four-poster, intricately carved mahogany with heavy green drapes. She was laying on crisp white sheets, a thick black velvet comforter over her legs. Beyond the bed, she could see damask wallpaper covering high-ceilinged walls. The furniture in the room was all large and imposing, more mahogany. A grand desk sat in one corner, paperwork and scrolls neatly organized on top. There was an armoire on the opposite wall. The realization that she recognized the room came the same second she also became aware of the scent that permeated it. She flicked her eyes upward, already knowing what she'd see. The foul-mouthed Falcon's poster was still there, faded and curling on the wall above her head. Hermione sat up, her heart pounding. She was in Draco's room at Malfoy Manor. As soon as she was upright, she saw him. Draco sat across the room from her, his long body folded into a wingback chair in the corner. His elbows were on his knees, his neck bent, one hand fisted in his hair as he rested his forehead on his palm. He appeared to be deep in thought, anxious. Hermione's breath caught in her throat. He heard her shift in the bed and looked up. He rose from the chair and was at her side in a flash. Hermione registered Draco moving abruptly towards her, and she cringed. She curled in on herself on the bed into a defensive position. She held her hands up and squeezed her eyes shut. "Don't!" she blurted out. She waited. Nothing. When she opened her eyes, he was stood next to the bed, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "I'm not going to hurt you." She blinked up at him, lowering her hands slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Draco's face was grave. His eyes looked tired, and he gave a resigned sigh as he looked down at her, chewing slightly on his bottom lip. Hermione let her eyes drift over him. Draco was covered in dried blood. It was crusted on his hands and under his nails. There were smears on his face, patches of his black shirt hardened with it. He saw her looking him over. "It's all your blood," he said flatly. Hermione looked down at herself. She was also covered in blood. Her grubby gray prison robes were coated in it. Deep rust-colored stains dripped down her front, and she could feel the now familiar sensation of it cresting across her face, too. You had a seizure. I think it was the legitimacy. The blood was coming out of your nose, and I couldn't get it to stop, Draco told her. I had to get you out of Azkaban before you died in there. Hermione looked at him. You got me out of Azkaban? How? He looked at her pointedly. I am who I am. If I want to do something, I do it. There aren't many people with the power to stop me. She swallowed, thinking of the swiftness with which he had disposed of the guard in the shower room. She couldn't imagine anyone would have argued with Draco Malfoy. She was suddenly struck with a thought that froze her blood in her veins. Your father. Away on business for 2 more days. I'll deal with him when the time comes. At odds with the way he'd been coming to her cell to stare at her for days, he now seemed to almost not be able to look at her. How do you feel? He asked, his fingers moving to pick at a piece of imaginary fluff on the bedspread, his eyes cast down. She thought about it. I feel okay. I actually feel better than I have since I got to Azkaban. He met her eyes, then she saw them soften. Relief smoothed his features. She waited for him to say something else. He hovered at the side of her bed. He was tense, the anxiety coming off him in waves. Hermione felt her own anxiety beginning to overwhelm her. She didn't know whether to be scared or to cry with relief. This version of Draco had lived a whole life she knew nothing about. Everyone was terrified of this man. And here he was, standing nervously at her bedside after breaking her out of Azkaban. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. The memories I saw in your head. I can't remember them all. But I keep getting fragments. The things you showed me. My father. I've had dreams over the years. Nightmares. And Hogwarts, it feels real, like I was there. But I can't grasp onto anything solid. She nodded. You had those memories taken from you, Draco. You were there. He pinched his lips together in a tight line. My father. He's only ever wanted one thing, and I've always known that he would go to any lengths to get it. He was struggling. Eventually he said, I thought I was worth more than that I meant more to him. The words were bitter. My father has always paraded me about, using my magic as a show of our strength. Everything I did was designed to let everyone know that the Malfoys were the most powerful wizarding family, so that no one dared go against us. I've killed. I've hurt and destroyed people, destroyed whole families. I did it all for him, to make him proud the way he told me I did. Draco's voice broke on his words. What I can remember from when I was a child. I'm not saying he was kind or loving, but he always made me feel valuable. I thought that was as good as love. His eyes fell to her hands resting on the comforter, then up to the bruises that had begun to bloom along her wrist, a ring of purple and blues encircling the bone where his fingers had been. He closed his eyes and didn't open them for a long minute. I'm a trained killer, Granger. I'm bred to be a deadly weapon, utilized in order to cause the most destruction and damage. The things you've shown me, I don't know what to do with them. It's too late. This is who I am. I don't know anything else. Hermione didn't know what gave her the courage to reach out her hand and grasp Draco's fingers. His eyes flashed to hers. He swallowed. She felt him move as if to jerk away, but he didn't. He kept his hand there. Hermione squeezed his fingers gently, the rust-colored stains beginning to flake from their skin. "I know you, Draco." He seemed to startle at her use of his first name. Hermione held his eyes. "I've known you in different lives, in different times. This isn't who you really are. You've been conditioned to think that this is all there is for you, but you've never been given any choice." He shook his head. "That's not true. The things I've done, no one forced me." "But you didn't know any different," she said. "All your chances to become a good person have been stolen from you, time and time again." She sat forward, moving towards him on the bed. "I don't know who you are in this life, Draco. I don't know what you've done, but I do know your heart." She reached forward, emboldened by her need to get through to him. She tentatively placed one of her palms over his heart. He remained as still as stone. He watched her, looked down at her hand as she pressed it gently into his chest. His jaw clenched slightly, and she almost snatched her hand away, still feeling the fear of this unknown version of him, but she forced herself to hold it there, pressing against the hard, tensed muscle. She gradually became aware of the thudding of his heartbeat, strong and steady under her palm. She moved her eyes slowly upwards. His eyes tracked hers, until suddenly they were looking into each other's eyes for the first time since he brought her to the manor. The thudding under her palm began to increase in pace. She pressed harder, feeling each beat, the pounding of her own heart speeding up to match the rapid cadence of his. The sly malevolence she'd seen in his eyes at Azkaban was gone. What she saw there now was a confused and hesitant disquiet. "I'll hurt you." The words were practically a whisper. "It's what I do, Granger. I hurt people. I curse, I cut, I make hits so that other people don't have to. I've done a good job of it. Until I saw that fucking hair. I knew who I was, what I was meant for." He looked up at the ceiling, his eyebrows pinched together, then back to her. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "But ever since I saw you when Zabini brought you to me, I haven't been able to think about anything else. I have these dreams about you. I see you in different places. I see you smiling. I see you crying. But I also see you covered in blood. It's in your hair, dripping down your face, and I think that I'm the one who did that to you." He rubbed a hand roughly over his face. "I've been fucking obsessed with you. I haven't been able to concentrate on what I needed to do. I thought you'd put a spell on me, like you put these images in my head to trick me. But now I don't know. They feel so real. You feel so real." His voice broke. "Those memories, "I don't think you'll hurt me, Draco," she interrupted. "Not anymore. I think somewhere inside you, you know me." She could hear the desperation begin to creep into her voice. How many times, in how many different situations, was she going to have to convince Draco Malfoy of this? He stepped back from her. She could see the internal battle he was having with himself. She moved towards him, but he stepped away again. "I need to go," he said. "I've got business. I need to sort some things out at Azkaban. I left in a rush. There's some mess I need to deal with." She felt a jolt at his words, not wanting to think too much about what he was referring to. He jerked his head to a door on the far wall. "There's a bathroom through there. You can freshen up. The house elves will be along with food and anything you need. Do not leave this room." She nodded. He made to leave, but then came back. "Oh, and this is important. Do not, under any circumstances, remove the necklace you are wearing." Hermione glanced down. Her eyes flared wide when she felt, rather than saw, the pendant under her robes. She reached her hand in and pulled it out. The stone was black, A swirling, smoky iridescence curled around within it, seeming to pull towards her fingers as she held it. The stone was held within a silver setting and threaded onto a delicate silver chain. It was beautiful. She looked at it in horror, immediately knowing what it was. Her fingers instantly fumbled behind her neck to the clasp. She needed to get it off. "No!" Draco's shout made her jump. She cried out and dropped the pendant back against her chest. "Leave it on. It's the only thing that stopped you from bleeding. The pendant could well be keeping you alive right now." She stared at him. "Essentiaspis magicae," she said. "This is a soul stone. I don't want this on." "I don't care what you want." His eyes were hard. He stepped back towards her. "You are not to take it off." She felt anger rise in her. "This has been taken from someone. It's part of who they are. It was probably taken by force. I've heard what you and your father have been doing. I don't want to wear someone's soul around my neck." He stared at her for a moment, his eyes flashing as he watched her hold it away from her skin. "It's not their soul. It's their essence, their magic. The person who gave it, who it was taken from," he grimaced. "They're dead. They can't have it back. It's currently keeping you alive. You ought to keep it on." "They're dead?" She felt sick. It washed over her in waves at his words. "Yes." "How did they die?" He looked at her, his face a mask of indifference. "It doesn't matter how they died. The fact is, if you take it off, you could die too. Please, keep it on." "Why?" she shouted, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. "Because your father wants me? Because I'm valuable? Is that why you brought me here? To keep me alive until your father can use me to make another stone? To make you more money?" "No." His face hardened as he looked at her. "He will not touch you. I can guarantee you that. No one will touch you." She couldn't hold her tears any longer. They spilled out, cascading over her cheeks, dripping off her chin and onto her chest. Draco watched them fall. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. There was no turning around, painting him as someone better. She had given him this life. Her misguided attempts at helping him couldn't be undone. The silver in his eyes flashed. "You are important to me, Granger. I've known it since I first saw you. I didn't know why then, but I do now, and no one will touch you, or even look at you without my say-so." She cried harder as she listened to his words. He was right. He was irredeemable. He was a monster, and now the monster had decided she belonged to him. She wanted to feel horror, to feel fear. She needed to, but she didn't. She felt something else. Still. And she was so ashamed. She couldn't justify how much she still wanted him, couldn't reach for him the way she wanted to, knowing that her friends were suffering, had suffered because of him. Draco watched her, seemed to see her thoughts as they entered her mind and traveled over her face. He nodded. "I'll be back soon," he said, and then disappeared with a crack. She wanted to ask him more, to ask him what was going to happen to her, but she didn't think she wanted to know the answer. She sat back down onto the bed, still gingerly holding the pendant away from her skin. She could already feel a headache forming in the base of her skull. She reluctantly let the pendant fall again to her chest, and the pain in her head eased instantly. She heaved in a deep breath, hardly able to process what had happened in the last few hours. She brought her hands up again to the hateful pendant around her neck. Who had made this? Did it contain the essence of one of her friends? She swallowed back the bile at the thought of Ron's magic swirling inside the stone. She got up from the bed, relishing the feeling of strength in her legs. even as she bitterly thought of the reason why. She made her way to the bathroom. It was decorated, predictably, with black, shiny tiles, floor to ceiling. The deep roll-top bath in the center looked extremely inviting. She walked towards it and put the plug in. Turning on the gold faucet, steaming hot water immediately gushed out. There were white fluffy towels folded on the side, and a collection of expensive-looking bottles of bubble bath and shampoo lined up on the shelf. Her eye caught on a bottle of aftershave in a black bottle with a gold label. She couldn't help herself as she moved towards it. She took the lid off and put the neck to her nose, breathing deeply. She closed her eyes as the intoxicating aroma filled her head. That sweet, woody apple scent assaulted her senses, making her breathe out a quiet sigh. It was so very Draco, and only Draco, that made her want to cry. He smelled like magic, a dark, dangerous, beautiful magic sparking inside her and filling her with desire. She reluctantly put the lid on and put the bottle down, selecting a bottle of bubble bath instead, squirting in a generous amount and filling the bath with sweet-smelling, decadent bubbles. She turned off the tap and gratefully slipped out of her dirty prison robes. She caught sight of herself in the mirror and stopped, staring at herself in horror. Her arms and legs were bone-thin, her ribs clearly showing. There was blood all over her face and on her hands and arms. It had also dripped down the center of her chest below the pendant. The purple bruises on her wrist were stark against her pale skin. Her breasts were small where they used to be full, her hips narrow, her hair was long and lank, her curls weighed down by dirt and grime. Her face was pallid, the dark circles underneath her eyes startling. Her eyes stared out, large and haunted. She looked like she was already dead. She turned away from herself, not wanting to look anymore, and stepped into the bath, groaning with pleasure at the burning heat of the water. She sank into it, watching the steam rise around her, relishing a simple joy of feeling clean for the first time in so long. After 10 minutes of luxury soaking, Hermione got to work, washing her hair several times and running her fingers through the conditioner until her hair wasn't a tangled mess anymore. She soaped up her hands and washed the blood off her face and body, smoothing the soap over her until she was clean. Eventually, she stepped out, grimacing at the pink-stained, grimy water she had left behind her. She emptied the bath and stood in the tub, turning on the large gold showerhead above to rinse. She eventually stepped out and wrapped herself in one of the fluffy white towels, sighing at the softness of it. She moved into the bathroom. There was a plate on the desk, a metal cloche on top. Silver cutlery wrapped in a napkin and a wine glass stood next to it. She could smell a mouth-watering aroma that instantly made her stomach turn inside out with hunger. She took the lid off and took in the sight of the perfectly cooked steak and crispy potatoes. The vegetables looked buttery and perfectly cooked. She attacked the meal with gusto, her hungry stomach relishing every mouthful. She washed it down with the rich red wine from the carafe next to it. Eventually, full and tired, she collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. She dreamed of Ron, his face replacing Draco's, staring eyes and blue lips. She dreamed of her friends still at Azkaban, rocking slowly back and forth in their cells, while she lay in a warm bed, clean and well-fed. She woke with a start, barely making it to the bathroom before she vomited all the food she had eaten into the toilet bowl. Her stomach kept contracting until there was nothing left. Hermione hung her head in shame. How could she have allowed herself to focus so exclusively on Draco, as though he was the only thing that mattered in the world? How could she sit here in a warm bed, safe and protected, while they rotted in Azkaban? She had caused this. She had created this reality for them. She closed her eyes again and folded violently over the toilet, retching, tears streaming down her face as she thought of them. Eventually, drained and exhausted, she returned to lay in the bed and waited for him to come back, drifting in and out of a fitful sleep. She awoke a few hours later, hearing the crack of apparition. Draco appeared, his eyes casting over her warily. He was wearing different clothes. His fighting leathers were gone, replaced with a soft-looking gray knitted sweater, round neck, a shirt collar peeking from underneath. He smelled divinely clean and fresh. The cuffs on his sweater were pushed up so she could see the God-forsaken dark mark on his arm where it had been before. He didn't seem ashamed of it in this life, making no attempt to move his arm when he saw her looking at it. The color of his jumper set off his eyes, making the silver unnaturally bright. He let his eyes travel over her, glancing at her body, wrapped in the towel, seeming to linger momentarily on the gap where the two sides of the towel overlapped, then snapping quickly away. He looked at her hair now, curly and fluffy again where it was clean. He spent a long time focusing on it, seeming to study it before eventually moving to her face. She stared back at him, wanting to scream with how much she had to say to him, but feeling unable to say any of it. Her words stuck in her throat. Gods, he was so beautiful, she thought as her eyes swept over the damp hair brushing the back of his shirt collar, the blonde strands flicking outwards. She looked to his lips, the shape of them, full and soft, and then to his eyes, wide open now, studying her as she studied him. He was like an angel of death, she thought, so beautiful yet so terrifyingly dangerous. Granger. His voice was low, his eyes burning into hers. Malfoy. She sounded as exhausted as she felt. Neither of them spoke for a moment. They just looked at each other. This is yours, I think, he said, and he bent and picked up something from the ground. It was her backpack. She felt her stomach swoop with joy as she heard the memories inside it tinkle together. He had brought it. She hadn't asked him to, but he'd brought it. She had no idea how Draco had known it was hers, but she had it now. She had a chance to save them all. She jumped from the bed, and before she even knew what she was doing, she had flung her arms around him. She buried her face in his neck and held onto him tightly. Draco stood, his hands by his side, rigid for a moment, before suddenly his hands were on her hips, sliding around until his arms were wrapped tightly around her too, crossing over her back. He buried his face in her hair. She heard him inhale a long, deep breath, and he squeezed her harder. She lifted her head so that they were face to face. Their eyes were millimeters from each other's. She could see the different colors in his irises, her own reflection in his pupils. They were huge, blown, wide. She brought her hand up and wound her fingers back into the place they always seemed to find themselves, tangled in the hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him closer to her, and this version of Draco didn't hesitate. He opened his mouth and kissed her. His tongue slipped in through her lips, sliding over hers as one of his hands came up to her neck, and he slid it up to cradle her head in his palm and fist her hair, gripping it tightly, angling her head up towards him, pulling her lips harder to his. The other hand curled possessively around her waist. They kissed like they would each die without the other, and Hermione thought that it was true. She felt like she would die without him in that moment. Draco's hand dropped from her hair and the other moved from her waist, both sliding around to her hips. He took hold of both sides of her towel and gently tugged at them, breaking the kiss to look down at her as the towel fell away and down onto the floor. His eyes moved over her body, and she had to resist the urge to hide herself away from his burning gaze. Draco looked at her like she were made of solid gold, his eyes growing darker the longer he looked. "Fucking hell, Granger," he said, and it was almost a growl. It was so low in his throat. His hands came back to her hips. They were large, strong, and sure, and she felt like she was made of glass, a delicate, breakable thing. The way he slid them down slowly, reverently, up her body to her breast. He ran his hands gently over them, his thumbs grazing her nipples as he brought his head down. She gasped as she felt the hot, wet sensation of his mouth as he took her nipple gently into it, sucking lightly and swiping his tongue over and around the hard peak. She pressed her face into the tousled hair on top of his head and squeezed her eyes shut. Oh! She was incapable of any coherent thought or speech as he moved to the other nipple, his tongue flicking gently as his other hand came up to squeeze lightly, cupping her breast in his large palm. She could feel the callus from where he'd held his wand, and the slight friction of it made her grit her teeth with pleasure. He came back up now to kiss her, his mouth hot and hungry. Their lips slid wet and soft over each other. He sucked her tongue gently, making her moan. She was painfully aware of her nakedness compared to Draco's fully dressed body. She knelt up on the bed as he pulled her closer to him. His hand slid around to travel down, splaying over her thighs and suddenly lifting her so her legs were wrapped around him. She locked her legs, feeling the wetness at her center immediately began to soak through the front of his trousers. He groaned into her mouth, and she could feel how hard he was, remembered how big he was as she ground down onto him. His hand slid up her thighs, fingertips gripping tightly as he came up to cup her cheeks, spreading his fingers out over her ass, pulling her harder against him, his hips bucking slightly against her. She cried out with the friction, wiggling onto him, desperate to feel more. "Draco, please!" She was begging him, but he didn't care. She didn't even know what she was begging for, except for more of him. She needed to feel him, needed to be filled by him. Finally, after wanting him for so long, it wasn't a want anymore. It was a need. She pushed away from him, unlocking her legs and stepping down. He didn't let her stop kissing him. He pulled her back, his hands still in her hair, but she pushed him away just far enough so that she could lower her fingers to his wrist and grab a hold of his shirt, lifting it up. As she did, she caught a glimpse of his Adonis belt, the V of muscle pointing down below the waistband of his trousers. She felt the heat bloom in her belly, a new wetness between her legs. She was slick with it. Draco took over from her fumbling fingers and lifted his jumper and shirt over his head in one go. She stopped to look at his body, noticing immediately that there were no Sectum Semper scars. Of course, he hadn't been at Hogwarts for Harry to curse him. That didn't mean he wasn't scarred. Draco was still marked. In 100 different places, she thought. Slashes, big and small, danced across his body. What looked like a bullet hole in his upper arm, although she thought that must be impossible. There was a starburst of small scars smattered over his one hip, and a deep gouge below his lower left rib. Countless other small scars marred his pale, smooth skin. He was broad, muscular, but lean. She could count every one of his ribs, along with the bumps of his obliques. She ran her fingers gently down his side, earning herself a shiver from him. The tall tent in his trousers jerked in response to her touch. She brought her hands to his belt buckle, trying to hide the slight tremble in them. His stomach rose and fell with his breaths, and he flinched slightly as her fingers brushed against him as she slid the leather through the metal. She brought her eyes up to his. They were blazing, the silver absolutely molten. She swallowed and dropped her eyes down to his trousers, unhooking the clasp and pulling the buttons apart, her eyes widening as he sprang free, the thin material of his boxers doing nothing to hide the large, straining bulge of his cock. Draco's breathing grew heavier, quicker as she ran her finger over his head through the cotton, feeling the pre-cum leak through. "Fuck, Hermione." It was barely a whisper, hissed through his teeth. She lifted his boxers up and over his cock, her eyes widening as she finally saw him, for the first time as he bent to kick off his trousers and boxers, and then stood in front of her, both of them completely naked now. She didn't know if she could do it. His cock was straining, thick and smooth, pulsing and twitching as she looked at it. It was so big. She never experienced anything even close. She raised her eyes to look at him. His jaw was clenched, his eyes absolutely burning. His breath was hitching, every muscle in his body taut. He was waiting for her, she realized. He was holding himself back, waiting for her to give the word. She stepped towards him, hearing his sharp intake of breath as she put her hands on his shoulders and pulled him to her. It was all he needed. Before she even knew what was happening, he had pulled her back towards the bed. He sat down, knees out, and pulled her up on top of him, straddling him. She was up on her own knees, poised above him, her hands on his shoulders, looking into his eyes. He didn't drop eye contact as he brought one hand down to take hold of himself. She let her eyes flick downwards and closed them momentarily at the sight of Draco Malfoy. His cock in his hand sat beneath her. She suddenly let out a gasp as he angled himself towards her, but he didn't push inside. Instead, he brought the head of his cock between her spread legs, and he dragged it up the slick wetness of her core. As soon as she felt the soft skin of his head slide against her clit, she threw her head back, unable to keep the moan that left her lips. Draco smiled and did it again, making her cry out a second time. She trembled as she held herself up, waiting, anticipating the feel of it, groaning with pleasure when it came. Hermione couldn't help herself. She began rocking her hips, sliding over the soft head of his cock, coating him with her wetness. "Look at me, Hermione," he said, and she tried to. She opened her eyes and looked into his. The gray was stormy, his eyes glassy with desire, heavy-lidded. Draco's lips were pink and swollen from kissing her, even fuller than usual. She brought her face down and sucked his bottom lip, running her tongue over it, her inside squeezing tighter at the sight of his beautiful face, flushed with desire for her. She rocked herself faster onto the smooth head of his cock, feeling it slide against her clit, the most delicious sensation and almost painful pleasure. Draco held himself in his fist, gripping tightly, his eyes flicking from hers down to watch his cock appear between her legs and disappear again as she moved. His jaw clenched, and his forearms flexed as he curled his fingers around his cock, pumping slowly up and down, sliding the head against her clit. She could see it in his eyes that he was struggling to keep himself under control. The sight of Draco, so clearly turned on by her, was too much, and Hermione felt herself beginning to build. She moved faster and faster, fucking herself on him as he breathed raggedly, watching her intently. It didn't take long until she felt herself begin to clench, her muscles tensed, and she dug her nails into his shoulders as she felt her orgasm crest within her. She felt the first rhythmic pulses begin, and she squeezed her eyes shut. Draco watched her, and then, just as she began to come, he pushed his hips forward and slid inside her in increments, filling her, stretching her. She cried out loudly as suddenly as she was coming around his cock. It made her orgasm ramp up 100 degrees. The thickness of him filling her up so completely that she clenched around him. She felt every inch of him. She ground down on him, fluttering onto him, making him grit his teeth and swear, his eyes falling closed. He waited until she had finished, her head hanging down, forehead pressed against his shoulder, and then he finally moved inside her. The feel of it, when she was already so sensitive, was so intense that it was almost painful. She moaned and brought up a hand to press against her mouth. Draco stopped and looked at her. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes," she breathed. "Please don't stop." She moved slightly as encouragement, and it was all he needed. He pulled himself out slightly and then pushed back in, bottoming out. She let her head drop back to his shoulders as he continued moving. He was so hard, so thick. His movements came quicker now, his thrusts picking up in pace. She heard his breath shuddering in and out. He put his hands on her hips, and he began moving her along with him, lifting her up and down his cock. She moved with the pace he set, lifting up and dropping down onto him in time with the way his hands moved on her hips, feeling the pendant bounce against her chest as she did. She felt it begin to build in her again, sensation of her clit hitting the base of his stomach. His balls was almost too much. She closed her eyes and gave into the rhythm, her breathing stuttering, her body totally in tune with his. She could tell when Draco was about to come. She felt him thicken and swell even further inside her. There was no room, and she squeezed around him, feeling her own orgasm begin to crest again. She opened her eyes to look at him just as he groaned her name, and she began to feel him release inside her, feeling the pulses of his orgasm, the cum pumping out of him and into her. As he thrust in and out, his eyes squeezed shut and his head tipped back. "Oh, Draco," she moaned as he dove into her and swore over and over again, his hands gripping her so tightly she thought she might have bruises on her hips from his fingertips. Eventually, they were both spent. She sat still on top of him, her legs wide, knees either side of his hips. Draco lifted his head up and opened his eyes to meet hers. They were slightly bloodshot, his face and body coated with a sheen of sweat, the scent of him sparking in her nose, mingling with the sweat of sex and desire. After a few moments, she kissed him gently on the tip of his nose and climbed off him, unimpaling herself, hearing him hiss slightly as he slipped out of her. She moved to the bed, needing to lay down. Draco fell to lie next to her, his chest heaving. He put his hand down to grab hold of the comforter, bringing it up and over her, tucking it in slightly around them both. Then they lay, their heads on the pillow, just looking at each other. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes." She smiled, and she brought her hand up to touch his face. She could already feel a soreness beginning between her legs. She hadn't noticed it in the moment, but she knew she'd been stretched to capacity. She smiled at the thought. It's not usually like that for me," he said. "It's normally rougher, more impersonal. I was worried I was going to hurt you." "You didn't hurt me, Draco. Far from it," she said, and he smiled. "You're back," he said. It's got the memories in. Yes, and your diaries. You left them. He frowned. Diaries. That doesn't sound like something I'd do in any timeline. She smiled at his confused expression. Well, they say your name on them, and you left them with your body. She realized even as she said it how bizarre that sentence was. He sat up. Let me see them, he said. Hermione rose from the bed, feeling Draco's cum sliding out and down between her legs. She clenched them shut as she grabbed the backpack and returned to the bed. Draco's eyes were on her, and she saw his cock stir slightly where it lay now, soft along his belly. She felt her own wave of desire as she saw his eyes darken, but she forced herself to ignore it and focus on the diaries as she lifted them from the bag. My wand, she said suddenly, realizing the jolt of despair that she didn't have it. It's in the bag, I think, Draco said. At least I think it's the right one. I went and got all your things from the processing room. I held it, and it felt like you. I sensed you through it. She looked at him in amazement. That was an incredible skill to have. It required a significantly powerful magical ability. She reached in and took out her wand, smiling. It was definitely hers. She'd recognized it in an instant, like she'd recognized her own face in the mirror. She used her wand to bring the books back to normal size, and then they both sat up and looked at them, resting them on their knees under the comforter. Do you know how to open them? He asked, trying and failing to pull the pages of the diaries apart with brute strength. I think so. I think it's the same spell you showed me, she said, smiling as she pulled it out of his hands. She set the first diary down and tapped her wand onto it. She recited the incantation as she remembered it, including their names, Draco Lucius Malfoy and Hermione Jean Granger. They both watched as the clasp sprung open. She smiled, feeling the thrill of success. Shall we read it together? She asked him, desperate to find out what he had written. Go for it, Draco said, curiosity on his own face. He moved closer to her on the bed, so they could both read the notebook together. Hermione flipped to the first page and frowned. She turned a few pages more and turned back again. Draco flicked his eyes to her, looking at her expression, and then back down to the pages. The writing on the front of the notebook was Draco's, but the pages inside were lined with row after row of her own neat handwriting. These weren't her case notes, though. They were still in the bag. Hermione was confused as she checked the front cover again, reading Draco's elegant cursive script. How on earth was this happening? She cast her eyes down to read, and Draco did too. They both read fast and turned the pages quickly, their eyes growing wider as they read. They sat for an hour, poring over each notebook, their faces growing paler as they moved on to later pages. Eventually, Hermione closed the final notebook. She felt sick. Her throat began to close. She looked up at Draco, who looked down at the closed book, his own eyes shining with horror. They reached for each other's hands, clasping them together on the bed, and their eyes met again. Oh, fuck, Hermione, I'm so sorry, Draco said. She could barely speak, her shock at what she'd just read leaving her numb. It's not your fault, Draco, she said, the words stuttering out between her lips. Draco stood then. He rose from the bed. She didn't even have time to react before he closed his eyes and lifted his hand. The notebook rose from the bed and flung through the air, hitting a mirror with a sharp crack, sending shards of glass shattering, exploding outwards into the room. Draco, stop, please, she said weakly, tears cascading down her face again. Draco heaved a huge sob but didn't stop. He closed his eyes, the tears tracking slowly down his cheeks as he destroyed the room around them. The bed Hermione sat in was the only thing in the room untouched by his devastated rage. Draco, She tried again. Fucking bastard, he roared. I'm going to kill him. I'll fucking murder him. Rip him limb from limb. Please stop, she sobbed. Draco turned to her, the tears glinting on his cheeks, his eyes wild. I've only just got you back, he said, and his voice wasn't angry now. It was distraught. I can't let him take you away. Okay, that was an intense chapter. Very, very spicy. So I don't know if I really told y'all this, but I only read up until probably the first part of where she's going into the prison scene. So I am learning these as I'm reading them. So I'm getting the shocks as I'm recording this. I just knew it was good and I heard good things about it. I was like, you know what? Say less, say less, say less. I'm going to read this no matter what is in this. And this was a nice chapter. I'm interested to see what's in the notebooks. Let me know what you think is in the notebooks. I have a feeling, I have my theories, but this is intense. I hope you enjoyed that. Have a good week.